So we're just going to dive right in. This will just be a quick overview. So some things that I invite you to think about as we begin this discussion about values within the framework of SPP. Well, why should we care about these things we call values anyway? That's a real buzzword in organizations and institutions right now. How might your work be helped by having clearly articulated values? And what is the relationship between organizational, institutional values and performance? And how do we relate the idea of values to ethical leadership? And what are those things that position us to be in the best possible space to act upon our values and those things that, that we know are right? And I'll talk with you more about that in just a sec. So, why talk about values? One of the reasons why we want to talk about values is that organizational culture is something that is either purposefully created or it happens more passively based on things like history, myth, and assumption. When it is operating at that level, when I go into an organization or an institution, I hear things like this. I don't know why we do it that way. That's just the way we do it. That's just our way. That's just our approach. Okay? And what we're asking you to think about is to take a slightly more thoughtful approach to all of this. Because when we have a clear set of organizational values, it really helps us create purposefully the type of culture that we need to achieve our goals. The other piece is that the values then become a reflection of how the organization approaches its work, how it interacts with the community and its constituents. It really provides some insight into how the organization sees the world and helps define and direct our commitment to social responsibility. The key idea here is that whatever we value is what we live in our organizations. Okay? Another way to look at this is that values are the foundation of organizational culture, and organizational culture is one of the top drivers of performance. So we have the ability to shape that foundation to create our desired culture, then specifically to drive performance. In terms of values and clarity, when we are clear about our values, then we are able to anticipate somewhat how we will behave and interact with one another, particularly between colleagues, between teams and decision makers, and between our organizations and broader communities. It informs how we make critical decisions and tells us what is important to us, what's important in our organization or to our team. The other piece is we need to do more than just identify the values and define them. We actually need to be able to articulate what does it look like when that value has been deeply incorporated into the organizational culture. Ethical leadership, very quickly, this is the idea that we know our core values and that we have the courage to live them in service to the common good. So specifically, this is about aligning our internal beliefs with our external behaviors and actions. So instead of asking what is the right thing to do, this approach requires us to have already decided what is the right thing to do, and instead ask ourselves, how will I act upon what I know to be right? In terms of thinking about this idea of core values, and before I hand this off to Nalini, some of the things that we can look to that help us begin to articulate that, well, we can look to our history. How did this whole SPP get started? Why? What were some of the founding principles or ideas behind it? Investments, where are we investing time, energy, resources, and what does that tell us about our values? How is that a reflection of what we care about? Look to our materials. What do we actually say about our values, about our mission, about our vision? This one, sometimes we overlook when we're talking about values, and it's incredibly important. and that is your gut. What do you know for sure? What do you know in your gut that is true about this organization or a particular team? And again, mission and vision. How are we serving our communities? How are we changing and impacting the communities? Okay, I'm going to turn that right over to Nalini.
Are you going to give these out? Okay, great. Actually, we could turn the lights on too, I think. So what Eric went through is kind of stunning in terms of its, whoa, this is really pretty formal stuff. And I think what I'd like to do, just in the few minutes we're going to take here, is just recognize that this wonderful SPP network group is really, it's in a stage of development like any other living thing. You know, it's like there's an egg stage and a chick stage and a chicken stage. And so I think we're sort of at the chick stage, that we're not tiny and new. We've been born, we're stretching our wings, we're getting feathers, and we're getting prepared to fly. And I think that when we think about the process that Eric just described, it's really, it's not something that happens at the beginning, usually, of an organization's work. In fact, this did not go on in any formal way or any articulated way or even any self-conscious way in terms of how the SPP started and how I think it sort of progressed in the ways, the wonderful ways that it has until this very point. So I think in terms of the word gut, I think when Dan and I and the founders of the project sat down together, it wasn't with any of this intentionality or definition of vision, mission, and so forth. But just to let you know, pretty rapidly, as we began being more than just one or two projects that happened to be taking place in prisons, we did set down a mission statement. And Jeff Muse, who was the first Kelly and the first Jocelyn, was the one who was really responsible for forcing Dan and me to sit down and write a mission statement, which has, I think, persisted very well. What came second, actually, in the sequence was the vision statement, was the larger overarching idea of what are we all about, how do we want to change the world. And then when Carrie came through with her expertise and her very good organizational abilities of sort of pulling out and synthesizing what are the things that we really know we must do, the essential components came into being. And so the leadership, as we were preparing for this conference, sort of realized that we need to pull together a more formal framework to articulate those values, those priorities, those challenges, and so forth that could help guide us, not to restrict us, but just to provide a framework. And so what we're going to try to do today, just to introduce you with this idea and to give you a little bit of background work that the four of us have put together, but in greater detail tomorrow under the directorship of Eric, we're going to try to pull together your ideas, your priorities in terms of going through this process. And I think because we already have a mission statement and we already have a vision statement that isn't really at this point up for grabs, I think we're kind of settled into that. And because we have these 5 wonderful essential components that have been put together and I think we've all agreed to and are practicing, it seemed to the four of us that probably the most important aspect that we had to focus on is values. And so if I could direct you just to this very first page of your handout, we have the initial framework here, which, by the way, I want to thank the Nature Conservancy for, because they're the ones who I modeled this from. But I populated it with the vision, the mission statement, and the essential values, the essential components. And what we filled in then, and what we have is a simpler version on this page 2. So, and then on the page 3, you'll see a slightly more detailed, more verbose version. We just put in some of the values that we sort of came up with as what we believed embodied the values of the SPP so far. So we would just invite you to take a look at that. On the very back sheet, you'll see a definition of some of those values, the original ones that we put down. So we've already made some modifications. And I'm not going to go over them now. What we want to do is invite you to take a look at this sometime this evening, tonight, early tomorrow morning, and think about what values you might hold in your work, in your state, in your prison, your university, that we haven't put down here. And eventually what we're going to be doing, again under the guidance of Eric, is to get some idea of what are the priorities, what are the ones, first of all, are there values that we missed? Question number 1. And question number 2, what are the most important values? Because ultimately these values are the ones that will help all of us make correct decisions in terms of taking on or not taking on the many opportunities that we're presented with when we become sort of at the chicken stage, when we're ready to fly. So really, there are two questions I'd like you to think about. Number one, have we missed any important values that you hold? Number two, are there priorities in terms of these values that you would like to be heard? Yeah, Tom?
So one that I didn't quite see articulated on here is related to opportunities for the incarcerated population to give back.
Okay.
And really, it's actually the other side of that. It's the opportunity for people like me to give back to society through a different way than I usually do. And that's through serving the community that we don't normally have access to.
Let's see. I'm not quite sure I could actually. Could you try to state that as a value?
Opportunities for groups to contribute to society through prisons. That's not quite.
You're not talking about the offenders to contribute to the community. You're talking about the non-offenders or the people
Yes.
who are giving lectures or
Right.
being the conservationists
Right.
or whatever.
So it's a way to contribute to societal good.
Okay.
By contributing to by benefiting the incarcerated population.
Okay. That's very interesting. No, I don't think we have embodied that. So, and again, go ahead, Carrie.
Opportunity to contribute.
Yes.
To the value. We just often think of it as something that we're allowing the inmates to do, but that's why we're all here.
Right, and when you mentioned earlier that you know what is this about in your gut? To me, is part of it is it feels right. It seems like the right thing to do, and that's a personal thing coming from me, not an opportunity for the inmate necessarily.
Got it. Got it. But I agree with you that opportunity to contribute could encompass
Exactly.
all of the stakeholders, so to speak, of whom we're working with.
Right.
And I think you're right. One of the sort of overlooked ones in terms of both evaluation as well as articulating this opportunity to contribute are the people here in the room who are the ones who think that they're only offering opportunities for the offenders to contribute. But in fact, it certainly goes both ways. So again, I don't want to take more time because I think we're short, but if there are any other questions in terms of process or what you're expected to do with this. Okay, thanks, Eric.